The Austrian Grand Prix was yet another FIA mess, and track limits is something that's going to be talked about at length over the next couple of weeks, I am sure. But before I vent, let's talk about the actual race. It's getting pretty repetitive now, but Max Verstappen once again easily won the Austrian Grand Prix. Despite being on a different strategy to the Ferraris, it was never really in doubt that Max would win the race, and everything sorted itself out. He was over 20 seconds ahead of Charles Leclerc by the end of the race, until he decided on lap 70 to go in, pit, put soft tyres on, and make sure he gets that fastest lap. Despite the fact that his own teammate had it, so at least Red Bull had that fastest lap point. But Max, well, he's super competitive, and I appreciate that. But what it also meant was that he was a full pit stop ahead of Charles Leclerc by the end of the race, which allowed him the opportunity to do that, pit, still come out ahead, put in the fastest lap, and win easily. That's just how comfortable they were. Ferrari will also be pretty happy with their race. Ultimately, they were the second fastest car. They didn't have the pace of the Red Bull, but Charles Leclerc especially was really quick. He had a fairly quiet race, but a solid second place. Carlos Sainz, he was a little bit more unlucky. He followed Charles Leclerc around at the beginning of the race, but then he lost time to his teammate when he pitted, and then he was given a 5-second penalty for track limits before receiving a further 10-second penalty after the race was over. This moved him down to 6th place, which was a shame for him and ultimately not really what he deserved. Perez worked his way well through the traffic and ended up in 3rd place after starting outside the top 10, with Norris in 4th, and another brilliant showing from the McLaren driver. He had great race pace all day, managing to get past a struggling Lewis Hamilton fairly early on, and he earned that well-deserved 4th place. I was quite surprised though that Perez and Norris didn't get a penalty though, as I saw both of them going over track limits more than 4 times. I appreciate the TV cameras can sometimes be a bit deceiving though, so we have to consider that, but a great result for both of them nonetheless. For Mercedes, well, it was a struggle. Hamilton got ahead of Norris at the start, but struggled to keep up with the Ferraris and eventually fell back behind Norris. He was struggling with the car from very early on, saying it was slow over the team radio, which wasn't much of a help. He had a black and white flag for track limits after only 12 laps, telling the team he couldn't turn the car into turn 9 and 10. A real struggle across the board for him. He was also told to change some of his brake settings as he was struggling with braking at times. He then denied that after the race though. He was due to finish 7th, but he also got a post-race 10-second penalty, so he ended up swapping positions with Russell and they finished in P7 and P8. Fernando Alonso also gained from the penalty situation, ended up in 5th, but he had a fairly uneventful race by his standards. So let's talk about track limits. The problem with the situation at the Austrian Grand Prix is that drivers were penalised well after the race, and the reason for that is that Aston Martin challenged the result with the FIA, making a point of saying, well, hold on, lots of cars weren't penalised. And they were right. In fact, 1,200 instances of lap times being deleted, and not all of them were looked at during the race. This meant that after the race, multiple drivers including Sainz, Hamilton, Gasly, Tsunoda, Albon, Ocon, Sargent, De Vries were all handed post-race penalties ranging from 5 seconds, 10 seconds to 30 seconds for Estebaon Ocon. Let's talk about track limits first. The white line defines the edge of the track, and there is an argument that says it doesn't move. There is another argument that says if this was Monaco, this was Baku, a street circuit, drivers wouldn't be going past because there would be a wall. And that's true, but you also have to say that a wall is, well, it's quite visible. The white line is actually very difficult for a driver to see from inside the cockpit. When they go wide, and we're talking sometimes millimeters or a centimeter, that can be the difference between an off-track and not an off-track, but you can't quite see that white line from inside the car. The problem here, though, isn't necessarily the issue of track limits. It's the problem of reporting it. Some drivers were told within the race that they were going off, but it wasn't always in a timely fashion. And some drivers were receiving penalties, but they hadn't yet been warned. Maybe their teams aren't warning them, but ideally there should be a situation where a driver is told every lap you went off at, let's say, turn 9, turn 10, but on that lap they are told categorically by their team or by the FIA, you've had 1. Then the next time you're now on 2. Ideally that would happen on a normal race weekend. The reason why it was a struggle at Austria is because the FIA were getting so many of them. And obviously they didn't keep up with them. And that's a problem. Because if we're going to enforce track limits in this way, there has to be a system that can manage it. And currently there obviously isn't. The solution is to put down gravel. And in fact, the FIA has suggested that for turn 9 and turn 10, that gravel is put down going forward. Obviously, it would mean that the drivers could then run to the edge of the curb, but you know, they're ultimately going to be losing time if they go any further. I could probably talk about this issue for a long time and it would be a little bit boring. Track limits is a contentious point and has been for quite some time, but I feel like the Austrian Grand Prix it makes that problem seem worse because of the design of the track. But we do like the track, but it's so easy to go over track limits. I'm hoping this isn't going to be a conversation going forward. The next race is Silverstone, and I am very much looking forward to that. It's one of my favorite circuits on the calendar. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed the Austrian Grand Prix weekend, and I'll see you next time.